Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP US History as we look at the growth of organized labor in the late 1800s in the United States. And this was important because things were changing in the late 1800s. Immigration swelled America's population, and the frontier was beginning to close. So the opportunity to go west did not offer as much of an ability to take pressure off wages in the East. Likewise, as more people came to America looking for work, wages began to stagnate, and in some cases even fall. Working conditions, likewise, deteriorated, both as there was less need to compete for workers and simply as technology became more advanced and machinery became more dangerous. And working conditions could be hard. Men, women, and children worked in crowded sweatshops, sewing or making other things by hand, or in large factories, working 12 hours a day, sometimes 14 or 16 hours, in some cases 24 hours straight, 6 days a week. And because people might go to work as young as 8 or 10, many missed out on their education. Although some groups tried to deal with this by offering school on the one day that people didn't have to work. So if you're working 6 days a week, which day are you not going to work? Sunday. Anything else would be disrespectful. So Sunday schools were originally organized by churches and by other groups as a way to provide education to people on their day off from work. So they certainly did use the Bible and other religious texts as part of their lessons, but they were meant to offer at least a basic elementary education, not just in religion, but generally in reading and writing and basic math as well. And while many were organized by churches, some were organized by other groups as well. Some organized night schools also. So after 12 or 14 hours on the factory floor, you go to school then, if you really wanted to. Many of these factories did employ women and children. And they were appealing as employees for a few reasons. For one thing, you can pay them less. Partly, they have no legal or social protections to demand more. And it's assumed that a woman or a child is not supporting the family. In theory, the man of the household is supposed to support the family. Any money his wife or kids are bringing in is just a little bit extra. Although in reality, a lot of families very much depended on the work of everyone in the household. And furthermore, women and children could physically do less than an adult man on average. In terms of simply upper body strength, a man is often able to do work a woman or a child cannot, although women and children might sometimes do work men could not do, as they could fit in smaller spaces, in mines, crawling into shafts too small for an adult man to fit inside. In a factory, if a machine jammed up, and whatever was jamming it up was in so far an adult man couldn't reach his hand into that space, you might find an 8-year-old whose hand will fit into that small space and work out whatever's jamming the machine up. If the machine starts and chops off his hand, well, there's always more 8-year-olds. So women and children could not only be paid less and were easier to boss around, sometimes the fact they were smaller let them do jobs that full-grown men couldn't do. And working conditions were often dangerous, with no workplace safety laws, no health insurance, no workman's comp, no disability benefits, no retirement benefits, at least in most cases. Some jobs did offer some of those things, especially if it was a job that really wanted to attract and keep a good worker. Railroads, for example, did sometimes provide some health care, even some retirement, because that was a job that was known to be dangerous and where they did want to keep a good worker. But in general, there were no guarantees. If you were injured on the job, you could be fired and replaced. Businesses sometimes locked their fire doors to keep employees from stealing, which in some cases meant when fires broke out, workers were trapped inside and burned up along with the other things in the factory. American factories had some of the most efficient machines on earth, but that meant it was difficult and dangerous for humans to keep up with them. But, as we have already mentioned, the idea of social Darwinism suggested this was only natural. Some people were more fit for success than others. If some people rose to the top and some people stayed at the bottom, there wasn't anything you could do about that. That was just science. Although, once some rose to the top, they did all they could to make sure they stayed there. Many large companies created company towns for their employees. The company built all the houses close to the factory, so it was very convenient. You could walk right to work. They took employees' rent directly out of their pay. You didn't have to worry about paying your rent. It was taken care of for you. Likewise, utility bills, water, electricity, gas, were all paid directly to the company before you even got your pay. And company towns typically had a store as well, where you could buy whatever you needed. You didn't need to leave the company town to go shopping. And for that matter, it's quite possible you couldn't go shopping anywhere else. Many companies paid their employees in scrip or in tokens, basically paper money or little coins made by the company, which you could only spend at the company store. So you were trapped in the town. On the one hand, it's convenient because you are close to work and the company's taking all your expenses out of your pay, but also means there's basically nothing left over. Many companies very carefully calculated it, so you would use all the money you made, which of course is scrip you couldn't spend anywhere else anyway, in the company town, in the company store. Some calculated even a little more carefully and made sure the average person's expenses, once you worked out what people usually bought at the store, would actually be a little bit more than their monthly pay. So that you might end up slightly in debt to the company, because the company store would always be happy to let you buy on credit and owe the store, and thus owe the company. There's many states passed laws where if you owed your employer money, you couldn't quit. So many employees ended up trapped in debt to their employer, which some came to describe as wage slavery. Employers tried to control their employees in other ways. A worker, upon getting hired at a company, might be forced to sign an iron-clad oath, sometimes called a yellow dog contract. In the slang of the 1800s and even into the early 1900s, a yellow dog was somebody who was kind of useless or good for nothing. So if you signed one of these contracts, you were a yellow dog. You were good for nothing from the point of view of the labor movement. But you know, if you have to sign to get a job, what do? And what this ironclad oath required was a promise that you would not join or try to form a union. And so if you did join a union, or worse, try to form one, you could be fired for doing so. So a way to keep unions from forming. If you did violate your ironclad oath, not only could you be fired, but you could be blacklisted for this or anything else. A blacklist being a list circulated amongst employers of troublesome employees. Again, primarily the sort likely to join a union. So again, as much as employers competed ruthlessly in the late 1800s, they would cooperate to keep the working class in their place. Now, workers certainly had threats of their own they could make. They might, for example, go on strike and refuse to work, so their employer couldn't make any money because they're not producing anything for him. And here are several images from the Great Rayon Strike in 1929 in Elizabeth, including the dynamited home of one of the managers at the factory. But sometimes, if it looked like negotiations between the workers and the bosses were going bad, or weren't going to go the way the bosses wanted, they could have kind of a strike of their own. Employers would sometimes have a lockout. They would lock their employees out of the factory, so the employees couldn't make any money. Sure, the factory's not producing anything either, But if negotiations over wages or something else were dragging on, this was a way to kind of get ahead of the workers and force them to give in and stop negotiating for fear of starving. If workers did eventually go on strike, companies might just hire other workers, whom strikers called scabs. And a scab is somebody who goes to work during a strike, which some people do because they were desperate for money. But a scab faced the danger of violence, threats of violence, actual violence, kidnappings, beatings, murders of people who went to work during a strike. So being a scab could be pretty dangerous. All, of course, being unemployed was pretty risky too. Now, one way some workers would avoid having a lockout or having scabs replace them would be going into work and then sitting down and refusing to work and refusing to leave. And a sit-down strike, where workers would occupy the factory so no work could get done. Here are some pictures from a couple different sit-down strikes in the mid-20th century, including one at a GM auto plant. You can see they're sleeping on the back seats of the cars. They're not assembling. But both workers and bosses said that these actions were necessary as part of the growth of labor unions. And workers said they needed to form unions to protect their interests. Bosses said they needed to be very active in keeping workers from forming unions because they were dangerous. Now, the earliest unions were formed in America in the 1820s, but they were not very successful. Simply forming a union was declared by some to be an illegal conspiracy. In the 1830s, the Massachusetts Supreme Court, in the case of Commonwealth versus Hunt, 1842 in Commonwealth versus Hunt, Massachusetts declared that simply forming a union was not inherently an illegal conspiracy. So this does say, at least within Massachusetts, but setting a precedent for other states, forming a union was itself legal, although it didn't necessarily recognize the right of the union to do anything besides exist. And striking was still often viewed as an illegal action. Now, unions and other groups that workers formed did various things. For the most part, they weren't having dramatic strikes. Some of the simplest things, not even going so far as a union, was creating burial clubs. Because employers did not provide life insurance, a burial club was a very basic form of life insurance. You paid a monthly subscription fee, and when you died, the burial club made sure you got a decent funeral. And sometimes other health insurance schemes, basic health insurance plans, or other things were created by workers' groups or even by unions. Of course, in principle, the main point of a union is collective bargaining. The idea that the union, as one group, can speak for all of its members at once. So it's much more effective if essentially every worker is asking for the same thing at the same time than if a single worker goes and asks for a pay raise. If one worker asks for a raise, it's pretty easy to fire him. If they all want a raise, it's a little bit harder to do that. And of course, there is the threat. If they don't get their way, they might go on strike. Now, there had been some small strikes in the 1820s, 30s, 40s. The first big strike occurred in the 1870s. Now, in 1873, a major banking firm failed, leading to the Panic of 1873. And this crisis lasted throughout the mid-1870s. Many businesses failed, unemployment went up. And in 1877, railroad workers in Martinsburg, West Virginia, saw their pay cut. But they accepted a pay cut, feeling it was better to have their wages reduced than simply to be fired. But then later in 1877, they were offered another pay cut. And 2 pay cuts in 1 year was too much. And so they went on strike. First in Martinsburg, West Virginia, which by itself, was a major problem, being in a central location in the eastern U.S. That shut down a lot of rail transportation. But pretty soon it spread as other railroad workers went on strikes in sympathy. In the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, when the trains weren't running, railroad company property was destroyed. Eventually, state militia and even the U.S. Army was called out, and many strikers were shot dead. And eventually the strikers gave up, ending up facing, as strikers often did, violence from authorities. But while the strikers didn't really get what they wanted, this didn't stop the labor movement. If anything, it showed the importance of working together. And so local unions, which did tend to be based at simply a single employer or based around a single type of work, began to form larger organizations, many unions working together, almost a union of unions, so that people in different jobs could support one another. After all, a factory often employs people doing many different types of things. And so if people in every different job go on strike, that puts more pressure on the employer than if just one portion of his workforce goes on strike. The first, or the biggest labor organization of the 19th century was the noble and holy order of the Knights of Labor. At first, it was kind of a secret society, which were very popular in the 1800s. They had secret rituals, secret passwords, a secret handshake, partly because that's just cool to have your secret handshake. But also, all that was a way to protect members from the bosses, if you could carefully keep out people who weren't members. But eventually opened up their membership to almost all workers, skilled and unskilled workers, whereas that was often a big division amongst the working class between skilled workers who did take years of training and thus could demand a better wage, a carpenter, a plumber, or something like that, in contrast to unskilled workers who could be trained in a few days and thus were more disposable. Sometimes skilled and unskilled workers felt their interests were different, but the Knights of Labor said they're all the same. Skilled and unskilled workers, white and black workers, at a time when white and black people often wouldn't work together, and when employers often exploited that, encouraging racial tension so their workers wouldn't cooperate. Although, while they didn't have both white and black members, they weren't going too far. They did not include Asians, or of course American Indians. They had both male and female members, at a time when many unions excluded female members. They're open to almost everyone, excluding only a few professions they saw as preying on the misery of others, preying on the working class. So they would not accept liquor distillers, professional gamblers, doctors, lawyers, bankers, or stockbrokers. I must admit, I'd like to go to a meeting of the Professional Gamblers Union just to see how it went. The Knights of Labor wanted a lot of things. They wanted an end to child labor, both for the sake of the children, who are exposed to a lot of danger and miss out on their education, but also, if kids quit working in the factories, you'll have a smaller workforce, and the people who are still there will have to be paid better. They want an end to convict labor, again, leasing out prisoners to work in factories or mines or elsewhere. This is particularly common in the South as a way to turn a largely black prison population into a moneymaker for the state, essentially recreating slavery, but was done in parts of the North too. This was seen both as insulting to the dignity of labor and, of course, another way to undercut the wages of the working class. So Knights of Labor wanted an end to that. The Knights of Labor supported temperance, wanting to limit or ban the sale of alcohol, arguing, of course, that alcohol was simply a trap for the working class. People would end up wasting what little money they had on liquor at the saloon, not being able to support their family, and by keeping themselves poor, by blowing all their money on liquor, That kept them in a position where they had to take whatever the bosses offered. The Knights of Labor wanted paper money. Believing that if the U.S. government would print a lot of money and create inflation, this would make it easier for them to pay off their debts, and generally make things more affordable. Now, this was also a controversial issue within the working class. Many members of the working class worried, at least at some points, that inflation would hurt them. Of course, inflation means prices go up. In principle, wages have to go up too. But many working class people feared that prices would go up faster than wages, that inflation would not help the working class. But the Knights of Labor believed it would. To do these things and to do other stuff the working class wanted would cost the government more money. And so the government needed to make money. The Knights of Labor wanted an income tax, a graduated income tax, meaning you tax the rich more. The U.S. had had this during the Civil War, and even for a few years after the Civil War. But once the war was over and the national debt was getting paid down, the income tax was eliminated. There would be an attempt to recreate it in the 1890s, but a pretty brief one, as the U.S. Supreme Court would declare an income tax unconstitutional. But when the Knights of Labor were founded in 1869, the income tax is just going out, and they'd like to bring it back, to tax the rich, to provide services for others. The Knights of Labor want an 8-hour day. Honestly, many working class people would have been happy with a 10-hour day to cut down that 12 or 14-hour day that most employers expected. But they want an 8-hour day, a legal limit on how long you can require someone to work. They wanted to create cooperatives, businesses owned by the workers who worked there. In particular, they wanted to open stores so they could buy from wholesalers and then resell to their members as a way to avoid doing business with the company store, to have an alternative to the company store where many felt gouged by their employers' prices. But just as many other small businesses couldn't compete with the big companies of the Gilded Age, cooperatives set up by the Knights of Labor typically were not very successful either. Officially, the national leaders of the Knights of Labor were opposed to strikes, feeling that the reaction against strikes hurt the working class in terms of public opinion more than it helped. And honestly, most big strikes did end up with workers getting shot, so maybe they weren't so productive. That said, local union leaders still often went on strike. And the Knights of Labor would lead other protests, supporting boycotts, supporting marches and rallies, and other things to draw attention to the problems of the working class. But eventually one of these would get out of hand. May 1st, 1886, a day celebrated as Labor Day in much of the world, although not the United States because of how this is going to turn out. A nationwide strike was organized, and by the Knights of Labor and others. Nationwide strike and a general series of protests, primarily in demand for an 8-hour working day. Although in some areas there were some other issues going on too. In particular in Chicago, there was already a big strike going on against the McCormick harvesting machine plant. And in Chicago, as part of these ongoing protests, one of many meetings was arranged in Haymarket Square on May 4th, 1886. And this was to be a meeting of anarchists, or at least organized by anarchists, to express their idea of everyone coming to work together without being oppressed by a government. As you can see, the advertisements for this were printed bilingually. There being so many German speakers in America that many things were printed bilingually. Although that also led some people to distrust the working class, or at least some of its leaders, feeling perhaps it was un-American. Now this meeting on May 4th began peacefully enough, but there were police on hand to monitor things just in case. As the last scheduled speaker was wrapping up, the police ordered everybody to go home and started marching into the crowd. Somebody threw a pipe bomb, which exploded and killed a police officer on the spot and wounded several others. The police pulled out their guns and started shooting into the crowd, killing several workers, and also some policemen hitting each other. I guess they weren't very good shots. The workers pulled out their guns. As good Americans, everybody had a gun in those days. The gun battle lasted about 5 minutes between the police and the workers. 8 policemen died, at least 4 workers, although quite possibly more. 60 policemen in total were wounded, and no one knows how many workers may have been caught up in 5 minutes of gunfire following the Haymarket Explosion. And it wasn't real clear who had done this. Indeed, some members of the working class suspected that agents working for some capitalist may have done this to make the working class look bad. But it had been arranged by an anarchist group, and so they went around and arrested 8 known anarchists. 5 of them German-born immigrants, another an American citizen of German ancestry. And of course, the most famous communist of all, Karl Marx, is a German, so clearly all Germans must be communists. In fact, probably all immigrants are. You never know. And there wasn't much evidence against these guys, aside from the fact that their political views were unpopular. But even with that limited evidence, they sentenced 7 of the 8 men to death. The other got 15 years in prison. They appealed their case to the Illinois Supreme Court, then the U.S. Supreme Court, without success. Eventually, the governor of Illinois, Governor James Oglesby, reduced 2 of the death sentences to life in prison. That still left 5 men to be executed, although one somehow managed to smuggle a piece of dynamite into prison and committed suicide by blowing his face off. But the other 4 sentenced to death were hanged. Although many people did feel this was unjust, and that they were just scapegoats for a bigger problem. Indeed, as I already mentioned, there were some members of the working class who thought the Pinkerton Detective Agency, or maybe some other agent hired by business leaders, had thrown the bomb to set off a riot and make the labor movement look bad. And a few years later down the road, in 1893, another governor of Illinois, Peter Altgeld, did completely pardon and free from prison the 3 men still left alive. And the Haymarket Riot, as it was known, was a national sensation. And again, much of the world, May 1st, when the protests began, is celebrated as Labor Day. But in the U.S., we commemorate our working class people on a different day, not wanting to celebrate the Haymarket Explosion. And although the Knights of Labor had nothing to do with the Haymarket Explosion, because they were one of the groups organizing the bigger protests during which it took place, many people blamed the Knights of Labor, and they went into a pretty rapid decline, breaking up with the different unions who were parts of the Knights of Labor, going their own way. By the end of the century, the Knights of Labor had gone from the biggest labor organization in the U.S. to being essentially non-existent. But it was partly replaced by other groups, although less inclusive groups. Of the labor organizations to develop after the Knights of Labor's collapse, the most important would be the American Federation of Labor, founded in 1886, the same year as the Haymarket Riot, by, among others, Samuel Gompers, a Jewish immigrant from London who worked as a cigar maker at this point in New York City. And the American Federation of Labor was not nearly as broad-based as the Knights of Labor. They were a craft union. They only accepted skilled workers, plumbers, carpenters, bricklayers, masons, people who did have to have quite a bit of training to do their job. which gave them a lot more bargaining power than easily replaced unskilled laborers. So they have no use for unskilled factory workers, nor, at least at first, did they accept women or black members. Two groups the Knights of Labor had been happy to have join up. Now, one thing about having better off members was you could require large dues to be part of the American Federation of Labor. If you join a union, you do have to pay to be a member in exchange for them representing you and sometimes during crises maybe being able to support you. As unions did try to build up strike funds to help feed strikers when they were unemployed. Because the AFL did collect relatively large dues, they were able to provide for striking members. Although they did prefer to avoid strikes, in preferring to organize boycotts of companies that they felt had unfair labor practices. And while they were more exclusive than the Knights of Labor, they were also better organized. They did have perhaps greater success. They also had more limited expectations. One of its main goals was to create a closed shop. In a closed shop, if all the workers at that employer vote to join a union, then in the future, that closed shop can only hire union members. In a closed shop, only union members can be hired, which of course gives the union a lot more bargaining power if everybody working there is a member. And they wanted better pay, shorter working hours, but in general were relatively conservative by the standards of the labor movement. They were against communism. They did not want a massive reshaping of society. As kind of skilled workers at the top of the working class, they wanted to kind of move up into the middle class. They don't want to overturn society. They just want a bigger piece of the pie during the Gilded Age. But other workers were more radical, especially the low-skilled and unskilled workers unwelcome in the AFL. And some did even support the ideas of communism made famous by Karl Marx. Others, as we've mentioned, supported anarchy outright. Again, in the 1800s, when people spoke of anarchy in a political sense, they didn't mean a complete absence of government, but rather the belief that if the existing governments could be overthrown, people no longer oppressed by those governments would create a natural communist society with everyone being equal and sharing everything fairly. So all we need to do is kill all the monarchs and business leaders around the world, and everybody else will live together in peace and harmony and sharing. And most union members did not want to go nearly that far. Now, summer of 1892 would see a major labor crisis in Homestead, Pennsylvania, where business partners Andrew Carnegie and Henry Clay Frick had recently purchased a steel mill, and it was time to renegotiate the contract of the workers there. Now, Carnegie was publicly in favor of unions and against the use of force to break strikes, but realistically, he preferred to avoid having unions at his factories. And knowing that negotiations were probably going to be hard, he privately gave his partner, Henry Clay Frick, permission to do whatever he needed to do to resolve the disputes, and then went on vacation in Europe, primarily in Scotland, but visiting other parts of the continent as well. So if anything went wrong, Frick could take the blame. Now Frick offered to negotiate with the union, but behind the scenes made all the other steel mills start overproducing to build up a stockpile of steel in case one factory had to shut down. And furthermore, Frick's negotiations were not viewed by the workers as really being in good faith. The workers asked for a wage increase. He effectively offered them a 22% wage cut. And then, when they clearly wouldn't accept that, locked some of them out of the factory. The rest walked out and workers in other Carnegie factories began to go on strike in sympathy with them, and beginning the Homestead strike in the summer of 1892. Frick tried to hire Scabs, but the strikers kept them out. And so he hired the Pinkertons in a private security force, although they actually did do detective work and other things, including spying and security during the Civil War. But they hired several hundred Pinkerton agents to try to get to the steel mill. When they couldn't reach it by land, some tried to sail on a boat down the river into town. The strikers shot back at them, eventually even bringing out a cannon to fire at the Pinkertons. Eventually, some of the Pinkertons were captured and surrendered, but were released when it was promised the Pinkerton agents would be put on trial for the murder of strikers killed in the gunfight. Although once the Pinkertons were safely out of the strikers' hands, they were never put on trial for anything. As things got worse, the state militia was called in. The town of Homestead placed under martial law. But many Americans did sympathize with the strikers. Until on July 23rd, 1892, an anarchist, unconnected with the strike, aside from sympathizing with it, broke into Frick's office, where he shot him 3 times and stabbed him in the neck with a sharpened file, which would discourage a lot of people. But Frick's too mean to die. Instead, he had surgery performed and had it performed without anesthesia. He didn't want to be doped up. He wanted to go back to work later that day. He sent a telegram to his wife and one to Carnegie saying, "Shot 3 times, not seriously." That being all the message he needed. Now, the attack on Frick was not the union's idea at all. The union was blamed. They called off the strike before any more violence could take place. Many were not rehired, especially the leaders, and wages fell significantly for the people continuing to work at Homestead. And in the next year, things got worse. As another financial crisis hit the United States, the Panic of 1893. In the aftermath of this crisis, the Pullman Palace Car Company, which manufactured railroad cars, particularly the famous Pullman sleeping cars, cut the wages of its workers in the town of Pullman, just outside of Chicago, by 25%. But while they cut wages, they had not cut prices in the company store or rents in the company town. In 1894, workers tried to negotiate, but the company just fired some of the leaders and then locked the rest out of the factory. But there were Pullman workers elsewhere. Indeed, every Pullman car was staffed in part by Pullman employees. So Pullman didn't just employ the factory workers, they had people working on the railroads as baggage handlers and porters and stewards and cooks and all sorts of things. But in May of 1894, Pullman workers went on strike to support the workers locked out in the town of Pullman. And they tried to get further help, turning to Eugene V. Debs, who was the head of the American Railway Union. Debs convinced railroad workers across the country to go on strike, or at least that all members of the American Railway Union would not work on any train pulling a Pullman-built car. And by June, over 300,000 railroad workers had stopped working in the Pullman Strike of 1894. And there was violence against Scabs, against other railroad employees, against railroad property. In particular, there was a significant amount of racial violence because the Pullman Company, among others, employed many black workers. Then Pullman tried in particular to employ former slaves, both to help them out and because he said they made good, obedient employees who were never rude to the customers. And at a time when it was very hard for a black person to get a good job, working on the railroad was one of the few pretty good jobs available to a black person in America, and a lot didn't want to risk losing those jobs, especially because the American Railway Union would not accept black members. They said, why should we strike to support a union who won't even take us in? So many black workers continued to work, and suffered violence for continuing to work, and of course because of the color of their skin. Over the course of the strike, at least 13 people were killed, at least 57 wounded, and strikers caused at least $340,000 in damage to railroad company property. Before it last, President Cleveland stepped in, sending in the U.S. Army to put an end to the strike. On interesting grounds. The U.S. government, of course, in those days didn't do a whole lot. And many people, including a conservative Democrat like Grover Cleveland, didn't think the government ought to do that much. But he sent the Army in anyway to make sure the government could do one of the very few things everybody agreed it ought to do. And what's one of the most important and most basic things the U.S. government does? Indeed, at that point, by far the largest part of the U.S. government.
The military, like protecting us?
Oh, the Army's not that big. There's like maybe 20,000 men in the Army. Even today, what U.S. government employee comes to your house 6 days a week?
Oh, the Postal Service.
The U.S. mail was by far the most important branch of the government from the point of view of most people. And by this point, the mail depends on the railroads. President Cleveland said the strikers were interfering with the U.S. mail. He broke the strike, arrested many of its leaders, including Eugene V. Debs. While in prison, Debs read the works of Karl Marx and came out even more radical than before. Eventually became the leader of the Socialist Party of America and would run for president of the United States as the socialist candidate 5 separate times: 1900, 1904, 1908, 1912, and 1920, winning almost 1 million votes in 1920 while in federal prison. So like Debs or not, he's no quitter. In 1905, Debs helped to found the Industrial Workers of the World, another labor organization that hoped to unite many different types of unions, indeed, to simply be one big union, to represent all working class people. Yet unlike the much more exclusive American Federation of Labor, the IWW, also known as the Wobblies, was happy to have any kind of member, skilled or unskilled, but also developed a reputation for leading violent strikes, being much more violent than the relatively conservative American Federation of Labor. Still, under the influence of the American Federation of Labor, indeed, as many Americans did start to become more aware of and more sympathetic to the problems of factory workers, particularly due to the work of journalists exposing the dark side of many of the big companies of the Gilded Age. State and even the U.S. government did begin to enact a few reforms to improve things for the working class somewhat, as an age of reform would begin in the early 20th century.